History doesn't bury rituals because they stopped working. It buries them because they still do. What if forbidden knowledge was never actually lost? What if the underground never really went silent? There's a category of historical research most academics refuse to acknowledge. It doesn't focus on pottery shards or architectural ruins. It examines ceremonial practices deliberately erased from official records because admitting their existence would mean acknowledging that ancient symbolic technologies still influence modern power structures. This field, often called dark archaeology, doesn't search for artifacts. It searches for patterns of influence that survive millennia intact, hidden beneath layers of approved narrative. These weren't mere beliefs. They were operational systems, tested across generations, capable of producing measurable psychological and social effects. Specific pre-Christian European tribes developed intricate chthonic ceremonies, rituals designed to access what they called underworld forces. Modern translations soften this to spiritual metaphor, but archaeological evidence suggests something more concrete. These weren't abstract prayers. They were structured techniques involving sensory deprivation, rhythmic sound at specific frequencies, prolonged isolation in naturally resonant cave systems. Sites have been discovered with acoustic properties impossible to replicate accidentally. Carved symbols repeat in patterns that suggest deliberate instruction, not decoration. Yet mainstream archaeology barely mentions these findings. Why? Because they reveal sophistication that contradicts narratives of primitive superstition. Egyptian mystery cults operating outside official temple structures practiced ceremonies dedicated to entities predating known mythology. Not the gods recorded in hieroglyphics, but older presences associated with the duat, the realm beneath conscious reality. These groups maintained knowledge that challenged state religion. Official priests worshipped order and solar power. Shadow cults worshipped fertile chaos, the dissolution that precedes new consciousness, the darkness that births awareness itself. They were systematically suppressed, their sites buried under sanctioned constructions, their practitioners hunted. But here's what almost no one notices. Recent digital archaeology, analysis of previously dismissed fragments, reveals these chthonic practices weren't just spiritual. They were neuropsychological, controlled sensory deprivation to induce altered states, repetitive sonic patterns to synchronize brainwave activity, specific visual symbols to anchor experiences in collective unconscious structures. Not primitive superstition. Forgotten technology. And certain communities today are rediscovering exactly how it operates, adapting ancient protocols to modern contexts with disturbing effectiveness. How voices from below shaped entire civilizations. Chthonic invocation. The term sounds archaic, yet the mechanism remains current. Chthonic derives from chthon, meaning earth, depth, what exists below. Not merely geographical depth, but psychological depth, the repressed, the denied, the unconscious substrate beneath rational thought. Ancient civilizations constructed entire ceremonial systems dedicated to accessing these layers, not as metaphor, as practical methodology, preserved through secret lineages, transmitted with precision that suggests functional knowledge rather than belief. Tribal societies across pre-Roman Europe conducted underground invocation ceremonies involving extended fasting, vocal frequencies calibrated to specific resonances, isolation within natural cave networks. Archaeological teams have documented the evidence. Stone altars marked with recurring symbolic patterns, remains of organic offerings, acoustic structures that amplify sound in ways technologically inexplicable for their era. Yet these discoveries receive minimal academic attention. The reason is uncomfortable. They demonstrate levels of symbolic sophistication that challenge established historical narratives about primitive peoples lacking scientific understanding. Egyptian shadow cults, never acknowledged in official records, maintained practices honoring chthonic entities dwelling in the duat. These weren't recognized deities but older presences, forces predating codified mythology. These cults operated clandestinely because their knowledge threatened institutional power. Sanctioned priests channeled solar worship and hierarchical order. Underground practitioners channeled transformative chaos, the decomposition that generates new life, the void that precedes consciousness formation. Their suppression was political as much as theological. What recent research reveals is particularly unsettling. These chthonic ceremonies weren't merely religious. They were applied psychology. Sensory deprivation induced measurable neurological changes. Rhythmic chanting synchronized group brain activity. Visual symbols functioned as mnemonic anchors, embedding experiences into collective memory structures that persisted across generations. This wasn't faith. This was technique. And here's what makes it disturbing. Some of these techniques are being reverse engineered today by researchers, artists, even tech companies exploring consciousness alteration and behavioral modification through similar sensory manipulation protocols. Why shadow cults were never truly eliminated? They were hunted, burned, systematically persecuted, yet never exterminated. Shadow cults, secret societies operating beyond official sanction, developed something authorities couldn't destroy: encoded oral tradition. Knowledge transmitted without vulnerable documents, without text susceptible to fire or censorship. Only voice to ear, master to initiate, protected by symbolic layers comprehensible solely to those already initiated into the system's internal logic. Initiation wasn't ceremonial theater. It was rigorous psychological testing, designed to select individuals capable of carrying dangerous knowledge without corruption or premature disclosure. The initiate underwent ordeals that permanently altered perception: extreme fasting, prolonged isolation, symbolic confrontation with mortality, exposure to symbols whose interpretation required direct experience, not intellectual explanation. Survival meant transformation. Failure meant silence, one way or another. These groups were labeled evil, heretical, demonic. Historical reality proves more complex. Many preserved astronomical knowledge, medicinal techniques, architectural principles that official science wouldn't rediscover for centuries. Others maintained psychological methodologies for emotional regulation, perception manipulation, collective narrative construction. Neutral tools, applicable for benefit or harm depending on intent. That's what made them dangerous. Not inherent evil, but power operating outside institutional control structures. And this is where it gets genuinely disturbing. Modern esoteric organizations, some operating openly today, claim direct lineage to these ancient shadow cults. They claim to preserve initiations, symbols, ceremonies transmitted unbroken for 2 millennia or more. Academic historians dismiss these claims as fantasy. Yet scholars analyzing the symbols employed, the ceremonial structures described, admit genuine continuity exists. Fragmented, adapted, but real. Which means forbidden knowledge never died. It simply learned better concealment strategies, evolved more sophisticated transmission methods, integrated itself into structures most people never examine. Comment here if this has ever made sense to you at some point in your life. How the forgotten is being resurrected right now. Something shifted in recent decades. Neo-pagan movements, modern esoteric currents, entire digital communities dedicated to unearthing practices history attempted to erase. This isn't nostalgia. This is active archaeology. Individuals diving into obscure texts, visiting ignored archaeological sites, reconstructing ceremonies from fragments. The strangest part, many of these reconstructions appear to function, not in cliché supernatural terms, but in profound psychological terms. They alter consciousness states. They create group cohesion. They produce measurable behavioral changes that persist beyond the ceremonial context. Digital platforms exponentially accelerated this process. Obscure forums, specialized channels, encrypted communities exchange knowledge that would have taken generations to circulate previously. Chthonic symbols appear in digital art, experimental music, even gaming environments. Ancient invocations adapted to contemporary contexts. Sensory isolation rituals recreated using virtual reality technology. Ancient and modern merge in configurations that would have been impossible 50 years ago, creating hybrid practices that draw power from both historical depth and technological immediacy. But a profound ethical question emerges here. Should we unearth what was deliberately buried? If entire civilizations decided to suppress certain practices, perhaps they had reason. Perhaps these ceremonies were dangerous not merely symbolically, but practically. Perhaps they altered collective psychology in unpredictable ways that threatened social stability. Or perhaps suppression was merely political control, institutional fear of decentralized knowledge that couldn't be regulated or taxed. Truth likely exists between these extremes, more complex than either narrative admits. Online communities exploring dark archaeology confront this dilemma constantly. Does respecting the past mean leaving it buried? Or does it mean bringing it to light, examining it, learning from it, integrating its insights responsibly? No consensus exists, yet the movement continues expanding. 20-somethings study medieval grimoires with the same intensity they'd apply to programming languages. They construct altars based on fragmentary descriptions of extinct cults. They perform ceremonies in remote forests, document everything, share results, discuss outcomes. It's research, it's spirituality, it's counterculture, simultaneously all three, creating something genuinely new from ancient foundations. What if some doors should never be opened? What these ancient practices accomplish, when they function, isn't magic. It's profound symbolic reconfiguration. They alter how you perceive causation, how you interpret coincidence, how you respond to environmental patterns. Not supernatural, neuropsychological, but the effect can feel so powerful, it becomes functionally indistinguishable from what previous eras called sorcery. This raises an unsettling question. If symbols and rituals can reprogram behavior this deeply, who else is using this knowledge? And for what purposes? Modern commercial advertising employs principles nearly identical to ancient Chthonic rituals. Hypnotic repetition, archetypal symbolism, subliminal emotional association, sensory isolation in the form of attention captured by screens. You think that's coincidence? Or was ancient knowledge rediscovered, stripped of mysticism, rebranded as consumer psychology, and deployed industrially? The boundary between ancient sorcery and modern marketing is thinner than comfortable. Both operate by embedding symbols into unconscious processing. Both create behavioral change through repeated exposure. Both function most effectively when the subject doesn't recognize the mechanism. Social media algorithms operate exactly like Chthonic oracles. You pose implicit questions through what you search, what you click, what you ignore. The algorithm responds by displaying content that seems to read your mind. Not telepathy, pattern analysis, but the psychological effect remains identical. You begin believing the machine knows you, that it perceives what you hide, that it accesses layers of yourself you don't consciously access. Precisely what Chthonic invocations promised. Contact with forces that understand you better than you understand yourself. Entities that perceive the unconscious patterns governing your choices. Perhaps authentic dark archaeology isn't happening in ancient ruins. Perhaps it's occurring now, in real time, as invisible structures shape decisions you believe are yours. Perhaps the rituals were never buried. Perhaps they simply evolved, became more efficient, more invisible, more integrated into everyday reality. And most disturbing, you might be participating without recognition. Symbols surrounding you constantly, narratives repeated until they become truth. Conditioned behaviors that feel like free choice, but follow predictable patterns observable to those trained in reading them. When you recognize the pattern, it loses some control. Not all, but enough that you start questioning what else operates beneath conscious perception. What other inherited rituals disguise themselves as modern innovation? If this video opened your mind in any way, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigations, and comment here, which part hit you hardest? The symbol only controls those who cannot see it.